In today's career conversation, I'm going to show you how to overcome your weaknesses that are holding you back. I'm Cicely, and I know that we all have weaknesses that may be impeding our success and our progress. And the big mistake that most people make, that you may be making, the big mistake is you ignore your weaknesses and you think they don't count. And I will tell you, in my 25-year career in business and politics, I've seen that mistake happen over and over again. And it became a detriment to the person who ignored their weaknesses. So today, let's fix that mistake. Let's talk about how to overcome your weaknesses and turn them into advantages once and for all. So pull up your chair. Let me show you how it's done. Here's the roadmap for our conversation for today. Let's define what your weakness is. That's an important piece of the equation. Next, let's talk about the 10 most common weaknesses because believe it or not, if you've never identified your weaknesses, then perhaps the 10 most common may help you as you map out your own weaknesses and what you want to do about them. We're also going to talk about how to overcome those weaknesses. That's right, that's a mistake I just spoke about a minute ago. We're going to talk about how you acknowledge, minimize, and diffuse. That is your formula for overcoming your weaknesses and using them to your advantage. So, with our roadmap in mind, let's jump in. Weaknesses are aspects that you can intentionally strengthen with practice, time, or desire. Now, that definition is important because, as we spoke about in the last video, self honesty, you have to be honest to actually understand what your weaknesses are. And if you understand this definition, that weaknesses are something you can actually do something about, you can fix them, you're aware of them, then that's an important distinction from what we're going to cover in our next video, which are blind spots, which are not known to you. So weaknesses are known to you and you can fix them. Blind spots are not known to you, and we'll get to that in the next video. But if you think and understand, not think, if you understand that your weaknesses are aspects that you can intentionally strengthen, so they're parts of your personality that you actually know, then the key is, how do you overcome them? How do you minimize them? How do you diffuse them? So, before we get there, the 10 most common examples. Let me make sure you guys can actually see me on screen this morning. There we go. Look, the beauty of live video. So here are the 10 most common examples, and take a look at these because they may not be a surprise to you. When I saw this list, they were not a surprise to me either. The lack of patience. That one pops up in a lot of conversations. And as I've spent the past 8 weeks coaching my clients in my weekly coaching program about how to overcome their weaknesses, and no surprise, lack of patience pops up pretty often on everybody's list. Organization, trouble with delegation. The delegation, we spend a lot of time on trouble with delegation and lack of delegation. The one that surprised people the most was timidity. Is your timidity, perhaps you sit in meetings, you don't say anything, maybe you're timid or shy or an introvert. How is that weakness being perceived? Is it a weakness? You may not think it is, but others may be perceiving it as you're checked out, you don't care. How do you then explain why you're an introvert, or how that comes across, and how do you minimize its impact on your success? So that one was one that garnered a lot of conversation and attention, and certainly you can see the other ones: micromanaging, harsh self-criticism. There's a lot here that we could go over, but I want to give you these examples so you understand at least a benchmark, a baseline of where to start your analysis. Because honestly, as we talked about in our last video on self honesty, you got to pull out that piece of paper. The left side, write down your weaknesses. As we'll talk about on Thursday, your right side, write down those blind spots. Because by writing them down, you are acknowledging that they exist. And that is the next step in our roadmap. To overcome your weaknesses, you have to acknowledge that your weaknesses exist. How do you acknowledge them? You identify them. You grab that piece of paper and pencil and you write them down. Now, when I shared my list with our coaching clients to get started, my list was long. It kind of ran off of the slide, but that's because in my 25-year career, I've had the benefit of actually getting in touch with my weaknesses and blind spots. So they're no longer weaknesses and they're no longer blind spots. And I've been able to minimize them. And that is the goal for you as well. So when you acknowledge them, you're just simply identifying what your weaknesses are. Write them down so they are front and center in front of you. Now, here's the key, and here is the secret that no one's going to tell you about how to overcome your weaknesses, and that is to minimize and diffuse them. How do you do that? You proactively bring up your weaknesses, you proactively minimize them to reduce their impact. Now, you may say, well, that's kind of random. What do I say? Do I just randomly bring up, hey, I'm an introvert and, start talking about it? And the answer is no. You'll find those moments when you're sitting in a meeting or you're in a conversation. Listen, your lack of patience is another one. When you feel that lack of patience coming on, when you feel kind of that impatience, maybe your anger, maybe your frustration, that is when you use those language cues. That is when you proactively seek to bring up your frustration and say, look, oh my gosh, sorry guys, I'm impatient for the results here. I know we're working through this meeting. I'm just going to, I'm going to sit here and wait until we reach the conclusion of this conversation. Then I'll bring up my points or my solution that I think we should follow. You can proactively bring up, as you see your weaknesses starting to come out or starting to happen, you can proactively minimize them by acknowledging them and diffusing them simply with language cues that acknowledge your impatience, that acknowledge you're an introvert, that acknowledge that lack of delegation. And look, I use a delegation one all the time when I had a large team. I would tell individuals, okay, you're empowered. I'm empowering you to make decisions on your portfolio of issues, but please understand, when I don't delegate something, it's not because I don't trust you. It's because when I've delegated in the past, deadlines have not been met, and therefore I end up having to do the work myself. So please understand my reluctance to delegate certain tasks, as I think they have to be done in a certain time frame. That simple statement, those 2 or 3 sentences, is how you diffuse, how you acknowledge, how you minimize that lack of delegation. You simply acknowledge and you put context around it, because as we talked about before, everything matters in context. The context is you've handed off projects before. The deadlines were not met, so they eventually come back to you anyways. So therefore, your delegation may not be as trusting as it usually is, simply because you've been burned in the past. So this is the secret sauce here to how you overcome. You acknowledge, then you minimize and diffuse. And understand, this takes practice. The language cues that I've shared in my coaching clients and shared in my coaching program, look, we've spent, like I said, 8 weeks on this. This is not something that you're going to just automatically pick up. But if you understand, once you have your list of what your weaknesses are, then you can begin to practice the language cues, putting those weaknesses in context so that when you bring those up, you are able to acknowledge them, minimize, and diffuse. And I do it all the time. I've done it with bosses. I now do it with clients. I do it with my coaching clients. It is certainly possible for you to overcome your weaknesses, acknowledge, minimize, and diffuse so they no longer impact your success. They no longer impede your progress or your goals. Now, I see we have some comments coming in. Thank you all for joining me. I appreciate you hanging with me. Let's just look at a couple of the comments that have come in. Good morning, Eileen. Chris Prouty. Let's bring up Chris's comment. I think Chris has an interesting comment here. Let me just make it a little bigger so folks can see it. I love this topic and the framework. In business, it is wise to understand your weaknesses and turn the tables to leverage them to your advantage. Chris, I'm going to say Chris Prouty, because I know Chris Rivera is joining us as well. Chris Prouty, I agree with you. The one thing I tell people often as entrepreneurs come to me sometimes for coaching is, this applies to you as a business person as much as it does to your employees. Now, if you're in business, you should be coaching your employees on how to, or your team, on how to minimize their weaknesses. But for me as an entrepreneur, I absolutely have to demonstrate my value every day. But as we've talked about, the other side of the value proposition are your weaknesses and your blind spots. And you must deal with them as well, or they will impede your progress as an entrepreneur. And I've seen that happen several times to folks who join my program who are trying to articulate their value prop to their clients, that weakness and blind spot piece is something that's really been troublesome to them as they've sought to explain who they are and what they bring to the table so that their clients find value in their work. So, Chris, I appreciate that. Have you ever known anyone who doesn't have a weakness? Now, all of us have weaknesses. Some may be more pronounced than others. Let's be clear about that. But everyone has a weakness or multiple weaknesses. If you think you don't have a weakness, that's because you haven't done the hard work to sit down and identify what they are. I guarantee you, if you ask a colleague or trusted source, a friend or family member, they're going to point out those weaknesses to you. So, Chris Prouty, that was a great question. Yes, Eileen, I love this. We all have weaknesses. It is part of being human. It is true. It is true. It is what separates those who are successful from those who are not successful. The key is self awareness, the key is self reflection. That's what we talked about last week. You have to get gut honest with yourself, to Eileen's point. This is not easy. To Chris's point, nobody wants to acknowledge that we have weaknesses. But you have to get gut honest about what that list of weaknesses and blind spots are in order for you to get past them. Otherwise, when you have those annual reviews, when you have those moments of conversations with your boss or your peers, and those conversations come up, they're going to ding you for it because your weaknesses are something that may be very known to others, but not known to yourself. And that's the blind spot piece we'll also get to in our next video. And look, let me just share it now because I'm going to share it again on Thursday. By acknowledging and minimizing and diffusing, you are taking away someone's power to use your weaknesses against you. Let me say that again. By acknowledging, minimizing, and diffusing your weaknesses, you are taking away someone else's power to use them against you. That is absolutely key. Chris Rivera, thanks for being here. Yes, intentionality is so important, Chris. I completely agree. And it is the intentional piece, Chris, that is so important here because, as we said, the big mistake that everyone makes is they ignore their weaknesses thinking it's no big deal when in fact it's a huge deal. You have to be intentional about the identification, which is what we call acknowledge, minimizing, and diffusing. So, the intentionality and being purposeful in this process is absolutely going to be your key to success. And look, I'm mindful, I'm scratching the surface here this morning. There's so many language cues that I've given my clients that to provide that context around their weaknesses. There's so many layers to this. So reach out to me if you have questions or want to talk further. I'm happy to have a conversation. But as you can see from the comments that have come in this morning, this is such a needed conversation, not only for those of us who are entrepreneurs, but also for all of you in your career if you want to be successful. So let's commit today. I'm asking you to commit today to absolutely tackling those weaknesses, making that list, acknowledging them, minimizing and diffusing, and reach out for those language cues. I'm happy to help you, depending on what your weaknesses are, figure out what those language cues are and how you can use them to your advantage to minimize your weaknesses. So, thanks for watching. I'll link to some additional training and a free career newsletter below, and I'll catch you in the next video.